All right, guys, so now we will take a look at writing interview questions. For an interview, you need to have a very good idea of what you're going to ask, and you do this by writing down as many questions as you can and then discarding the ones that you don't need, are confusing, are irrelevant, inappropriate, or repeat themselves. To conduct an interview, we use the research instrument that we call the interview schedule. And the interview schedule is a list of questions or areas that you want to cover in the interview. It has three main parts: the opening, the body, and the closing. So how do you write the questions for an interview schedule? First, you write down your research objectives or research questions. Using the objectives and research questions, you now create major topics. These are your headings. For each objective or research question, you're going to write a bunch of questions that are related to that particular topic. Then, once you have these questions, you will remove any that are redundant, irrelevant, confusing, don't make sense, etc. And you will stay for each heading, you will stay with the best questions. Then you're going to order your questions. Remember that you want to have warm-up questions as your opening questions to relax your respondent. Usually these things are your demographic questions, as well as other questions that you might want to ask that are pertinent to the research project, but are easier to answer. When you are wording your questions for an interview, you want to start those questions with how instead of why, because the words how tends to get your respondents to talk a little bit more. You also want to ask probing questions, questions that are not clear-cut and straightforward. You don't want questions with easy yes or no answers. Now, by the way, going back to the how and the why, it doesn't mean that you ask all your questions with how. It's just better to start questions with how as opposed to why for the most part. Arrange your questions in order. So always think about the flow of the interview and leave the embarrassing and difficult questions for last. In the closing section, ask questions that make your respondent glad that they talked to you, and then thank them for their time and cooperation, just like you did with the consent form. So when you are actually conducting the interview, make sure to provide the consent form at the beginning. For interviews, you're not using just a cover letter. You're using an actual consent form in the traditional way that you have been taught within this course. This course is Research Methods, RSCH 2014. You want, when you are conducting the interview, that you use a comfortable and safe space. If you're dealing with a particularly sensitive topic in which you believe that there might be strong emotions involved on behalf of the respondent, you always want to ensure that you and the respondent have a safe way out. So you usually sit with you readily close to the door and the respondent close after. So like I said, for interviews, we use an interview schedule that has these three main parts: the opening, the body, and the closing. Now, what are some things to avoid during an interview? You want to avoid asking more than one question at a time. And in fact, you want to avoid that for all research instruments. Make sure that each question deals with one topic or one issue at a time. Do not ask for hearsay or opinions on behalf of others. Again, remember, if you want to know about somebody in particular, you ask that person in particular. Don't be afraid to ask embarrassing questions and try to avoid judgmental reactions, in particular your facial expressions. So sometimes you might be in a position where you need to ask questions about something gruesome or something particularly sensitive that might elicit a strong reaction from you, the researcher. You want to always maintain a neutral face as much as possible so that you don't discourage the participant from answering you. In particular, if they're talking about something that is uncomfortable, but they don't seem uncomfortable, answering the questions that you are asking. Now, the interview schedule, which is used for interviews, is also used for focus groups. So I'm going to go quickly into how to plan a focus group. One, you identify your participants. Usually, you will use a specific sample that is best suited for the topic that you are doing. You want to limit it, the focus group, to 6 to 10 participants at best. Then you choose a location, preferably one that is as comfortable as possible. AC is always welcome, and prepare your questions in the same method as the interview. That is, you also create an interview schedule. Then arrange the location, set up your equipment. You will need recording equipment for a focus group. You will use a recorder to record what is being said, and preferably video format so that you can record responses if that is relevant to you. And because people tend to show up when there's free food and drinks, always include free food and drinks. Once you are within the focus group, greet your participants, help them to relax and feel comfortable, give out name tags so you know who you're talking to, inform them of the purpose of the study, provide the consent forms and collect it back, collect your demographic information, which usually will go in the opening section, establish ground rules because of course you have a number of people together and you're interviewing them at once. So you want to have certain ground rules for speaking, such as raise your hand or allow everybody a turn, etc. And always check out what to do with phones. Ensure that all the participants agree to the basic ground rules and then provide each one of them with an opportunity to speak. Ask questions and keep the discussion going, but always monitor the time. And as usual, monitor your facial expression for unacceptable reactions. Make sure to take notes in addition to the recording. And once you have completed the focus group, summarize the main points that were stated within the discussion, write down any additional information that you missed, make sure that you always write body language. And so this is why the video format is always helpful, but we know as researchers, not always possible. Then check for the quality of the recording, make sure that everything was recorded. And lastly, transcribe the interview and code the responses. Remember that if you are doing a focus group, you are using a qualitative method and therefore need to use qualitative methods of data analysis. And that's the basics for interviews and focus group, specifically creating the interview schedule.